was that long, I don't know, a week and a half ago or something like that. I was ordering a couple of new books for the library, for my personal library, well, including one I was quite excited about from an author that I've started reading the last little bit, a guy by the name of Jared Wilson. He wrote a book called Your Jesus is Too Safe, and he's somebody who's kind of challenged my thinking in a few different ways. He wrote this book that, according to what I was reading about it anyways, was to challenge us not to be content with what we know about Jesus, but forever in our lives to delve deeper into His grace, His hope, His love. To let Him push us always to be better. Now, the problem is, I ordered that book. I'm not reading that book. I am hoping that whoever broke into the post office and stole all those packages is reading the book right now. My replacement copy is apparently on its way, but that's okay. Sometimes we get these ideas about Jesus. Maybe Jesus had a different plan, that the person who broke in the post office needed that book. I don't know. One can only hope. And I do hope that it does challenge me when it gets here, because the bottom line is this. You know, we all have preconceived ideas about Jesus, whether it be me as a pastor, whether it be whoever broke into the post office. We all have preconceived ideas about Jesus, and we all need to be challenged to go deeper into Him and into His love, because we never know enough about Jesus, and we never know enough about His mission. All of us hold various views of the world, philosophies that structure our thinking and our lives, and we see Jesus through them. We can miss the point very quickly. We're called on to know Jesus first and foremost. And I read a little bit earlier in the service from Colossians chapter 2, which is a chapter that's talking about that there are some people who are being deceived by misinformation about life and about faith. And Paul starts writing to these people who he's worried about. Although he's becoming more and more assured that maybe they're not completely off track. But he's writing to them saying, you need to know God exists fully in Jesus. You want to know about the Creator God. You want to know about the all-powerful Creator deity. Know Jesus. Because within Him is the full glory and authority of God. And you can know Jesus. You can know Jesus absolutely. And He gives us a promise to these people. The same promise that He gives to us, that Jesus lives in us. And if Jesus lives in us, we have the full authority and power of God in our lives. It is a promise of God that you are complete in Jesus. Through this year, we're looking at some of the promises of God we find in the Bible. I said before that I took a whole bunch of promises of God, just put them on little cards, shuffled them up, and from my perspective, just randomly started pulling them out and saying, well, I'll preach on that this week. And this week we come to one that I think God wants, as I say, it's random. I think it's being very much led by the Holy Spirit as to where we are putting these. And this week, we're coming to this idea that Jesus was complete because God resided fully in Him, and you and I are complete because Jesus resides in us. Particularly from that passage in Colossians, we're looking at this little piece that says, for in Him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in Him who is the authority. You have been filled in Him who is the head of all rule and authority. Here is Jesus, the fullness of God in physical body. God is not physical like you and I. We understand the world in 4 dimensions. We understand height, width, depth, and time. God does not exist within those. He is beyond those. He created those dimensions from outside. He is bigger than our existence. Man, we're going to start off with some deep philosophy, aren't we? He is bigger than us, is the bottom line. In Jesus, God, however, became one of us. Fully 100% human. God completely. But he takes these 2 opposing things, the fact that God exists outside of the physical realm, and he takes the physical realm and he puts them together, and there we find Jesus. The material and immaterial at the same time. As a human, Jesus is just like us. He is limited. He is surrounded by a godless culture and put into difficult, if not seemingly impossible situations. Just like us. As God, he is not like us. He is unlimited, immersed in his own spiritual being and from the eternal realms. Jesus, as God, accepted the limitations of humanity when he became Jesus. He cannot be accused of just being God out there who doesn't understand us. But instead, Jesus is God coming to me. To bring me the love, the hope, the mercy of God. Oh, it's deep theology. But it's important. It's important. I'm illustrating it this way. Like a few decades ago, there was a book that became quite famous for a while called The Ragamuffin Gospel. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it or read it, but it's written by a man named Brennan Manning. And part of it, he's telling the story of why he's called Brennan, because that wasn't actually his first name. It's Richard. But he kind of grew up teen years during World War II. And during those years, he had a best friend by the name of Ray. Ray and him did everything together. They, particularly in the teenage years, they were just inseparable. When they worked hard, they grew up in New York City, they worked hard to come up with money to buy a car that they could share. They would go on dates together. They went to school together. There wasn't anything that they did together. They got to the end of high school. They even decided, well, what are we going to do now? And they decided to join the army together. It seemed like a good idea. World War II was over, so it sounded like a safer time to join the army, except right away the Korean War started. And they got shipped off to Korea together, and they were together completely. One day they were sitting in a foxhole. Ray was listening to his friend talk about the good old days back in New York, eating a chocolate bar, when all of a sudden they looked over and a live grenade had landed in their foxhole. Ray looked over at his friend, smiled, and dropped his chocolate bar and fell on the grenade. It exploded, he was killed, but Manning's life was spared. He actually took the last name of his friend, which was Brennan, and made it his own first name. It's kind of a tribute. Several years passed, and he found himself back in Brooklyn, went to visit his friend's mom, as he often did, and they sat up one night just drinking tea and chatting. All of a sudden, he looked at his friend's mom and said this: "Do you think Ray loved me?" And she all of a sudden got quite animated, jumped off the couch, started shaking her finger, and shouted at him, "What more could he have done for you?" And Brennan said at that moment it was almost like God spoke deeply into his life and gave him almost like a vision. It wasn't quite a biblical idea of vision, but almost like he spoke deep into his life, and it was like it wasn't his friend's mom jumping up in front of him. He said it was like he said this: "Does God really love me?" And instead of his friend's mom jumping up, it was Mary, pointing to the cross and saying, "What more could he have done? What more could he have done?" It's the idea. I start with all this theology and philosophy, and we're going to get into that a little bit because that's kind of the way this passage goes. But it's all to direct us towards this. Here is how much God loved you. He loved you so much that he would send Jesus, God himself, into bodily form. So you'd be filled with him. The one who is head over all rule, all authority. He exists within your very life. And he paid a great price to get there. But this is how much he loves you. And that's the gist of all this, that God is trying to draw us into his mighty kingdom. God is drawing us into his power. God is drawing us towards himself. There's opposition. There's reasons why we do not know this all the time. I read before some the verses went right before this. About different ways of thinking that people have that are not based on God's created order. It talks about rulers and authorities, which somewhat refer to the devil and demons and spiritual realms that are evil. But also can refer to some human ways of thinking that are not based on the way of God. Human philosophies and political thought that often can affect the church. I mean, these days we live in what seems like is a over the top, angry political climate, don't we? And sometimes it can consume our very society, can consume us. That we run into people thinking that maybe if elections go a certain way, that God is stopped, that God is thwarted, or that if people don't agree with me, that almost like God cannot work. And we become consumed with the climate around us. And there's so many different ways that we can look at this world and see this world. And yet if God is the creator, it is his way that we should be striving to understand and to live by. The only way to God, the only way to the Father is through Jesus. And he is fully present within those who believe in him, dwelling within us. Therefore, anything that is within either the physical or spiritual world is under God, and therefore is not something that we should fear. God is at work. Watching a TV show a while ago that got talking, and Zoe and I were watching, was talking about it was a travel show. It was a travel show they were talking about going to Germany, in particular the city of Berlin, and I was watching it with rapt interest because I had been to the places they were showing many years ago. And it was talking particularly about going through Berlin and through what used to be East Berlin. And he was walking through an area that I could picture because I had been there. And particularly when the Cold War was going on and the city of Berlin got split in half and the Berlin Wall was going through the middle of the city. It went through the very heart of what was kind of the gathering place for the city. And so west, the main gathering spot got moved a little bit over. And in the east, there was a certain square called Alexanderplatz that the East German authorities decided would become kind of the center of East Berlin. It would become the heart of the city. The problem is, as people approached the city, there was one thing that they saw, first and foremost, that towered above this square, and it was the churches and the cross on top of the church. And they really didn't want that to be the big thing that everybody noticed when they came to this square. And so they erected a giant TV tower. It was, at the time, the tallest freestanding structure in Europe. It was massive. Went way above them. Way above the city. And so it towered above the church. Now, I don't know if you can tell this from this picture. When I looked at it this morning, I realized it didn't necessarily show up well in the screen, but when the sun hit this tower that the communists put up, you can see that it kind of makes a cross. And everybody's first thing that they would notice was they would walk in and they would notice the cross that they had tried to put up higher than the other crosses. Now, granted, it only worked on a sunny day. But it became a symbol to many people that God's thinking was higher than humanity's. God was at work. And the bottom line is this: many are deceived. Even in the church, we become focused on the material, we become focused on earthly human concerns. The authorities of this world are not necessarily always people that control, but worldviews, teachings, experiences. We can fall into ideas that what everybody else thinks is important is what matters the most. But God is the ultimate rule and authority. We need to be in His power. And indeed, we have it. There is a promise of God that He is the head of all rule and authority. He's the head of everything that is found in this world. He's there. And He's with us and filling us. And we need to be in His power. Now, it's interesting because go on to talk about, okay, if God is in control, everything should go right from our perspective, right? And he goes on to talk about the fact that, you know what, if we fully fall into God's way of thinking and understanding Him and following His lead, it's not going to lead to everything going right. It's probably going to actually lead to things going wrong. Because His goal isn't necessarily to make everything comfortable. There's a story that I was reading of somebody else. Lots of travel stories this week. Somebody else who was gone on a trip, and they had gone to visit some orange groves. And it was during a time of drought, and their tour guide was taking them through and saying, yeah, they don't look very healthy, do they? Everything kind of looks a little brown, and yeah, the orange crop doesn't look that great. I said, hang on for a minute though. Go through this grove. I want to take you to another one that. And the guide said that that's actually my little grove. And went over there, and the trees actually looked a little bit better in this guide's orange grove. And he said, you know why they look better? Give it a couple of weeks, and they'll start to look a little, withered as well, and they won't look perfect. He said, the difference between this grove and that one is this. That one, when the trees were young, they did a lot of irrigation. Dumped a lot of water on them. This grove, it didn't. The result is that when they were young, it took longer for them to start producing fruit because their main energy went into diving their roots down deeper. And their roots are much deeper than these ones that are affected by drought over here. They're being scorched by the sun, but mine are finding moisture at greater depth. That's what God is doing in our lives. His goal is that we are growing deeper. That we have strength. That we have the ability to endure. not just find everything right. And I am supposed to fit into his plan. The full deity of God dwells in Jesus. He dwells in us fully, completely. The key word in all this is this idea, and you have been filled. The way that it's stated in the Greek, which was the language that the New Testament was written in, is you are being filled. You are being filled and you are being filled. That God is at work in our lives. That the God above is above our fears, our sorrows, our struggles. And he is fully and absolutely with us, acting to draw us deeper. And sometimes we might wonder, where is God? In a world that's out of control, the answer is he's right here. He's right here. He is the head, the authority, absolutely. And we live in a world that is out of control. Not just today, it's been out of control ever since way back in the Garden of Eden. The only thing is sometimes this world out of control can make me take my eyes off of Jesus, and instead I look at the chaos. Because sometimes life gets in the way. Am I looking at the problems? Am I looking at the struggle? Am I looking at just kind of the way the world works? Where when it was over. In a couple of minutes, well, not quite at the end, don't get excited. But in a couple of minutes we're going to sing our closing hymn. What a friend we have in Jesus. I think it's probably familiar to everybody here. Written by someone whose health was stolen from them, left blind. In an era where that made life almost impossible. And the author of the hymn, Fanny Crosby, turns her deeper into prayer. The fact that everything goes wrong, it turns her deeper into finding, instead of finding her satisfaction in sight, what she can see, turns her to finding her satisfaction fully in Jesus. To finding out that when I don't have the things of this world, that when the philosophies and ideas of the world, when the things that everybody thinks is so important are gone, I'm left just with Jesus. And discovering that his love is mine. That the fullness of the Creator God is promised to me. That I have Jesus. That sometimes the things that I don't see in this world are what really matters. That maybe the problems and the wisdoms of this world are not what are important. And that when they are gone, the true power of Jesus is released into my life, and that is power. That a God who wants two great things in our world is left. A God who wants to bring healings and miracles, who wants to see love grow in our world. Might not always see the world listening to us, even as we turn to Jesus. In fact, that's the promise, that there'll be opposition. But it will change lives. And as I look fully into Jesus, and as the love just grows in my life, and then it's released into this world, it changes everything. And the fullness of eternity will exist within my life. And one day I'm going to know fully, but today, even now, I can know. I can know the eternal God. And if anything other than Jesus is filling our gaze, we're looking at human wisdom. Don't let this world and its worries be our focus. Jesus is the absolute. Jesus is our love. Let's look at Jesus. I invite our worship team to come forward.